In early 1972, Northern California entered a period of fear that would last nearly 2 years. Young girls and women began disappearing, vanishing from everyday settings, many while hitchhiking. At the time, hitchhiking was a cultural norm, especially among youth. But someone, or perhaps several people, were exploiting that trust. The nightmare began on February 4, 1972. Two young friends, 12-year-old Maureen Sterling and 13-year-old Yvonne Weber, left their homes in Santa Rosa. They planned to hitchhike to the Redwood Empire Ice Arena. They never arrived. When their parents came to pick them up, the girls were gone. For nearly a year, the only clue was silence. On December 28, 1972, their skeletal remains were discovered down a steep embankment on Franz Valley Road. It was the first confirmed indication that something more sinister was happening. More victims followed. Girls and young women between the ages of 12 and 23 began to disappear under eerily similar circumstances. All were petite. Many had long hair parted down the middle. Most were last seen hitchhiking or in a situation where they would likely have accepted a ride. The cases grew in number. The media dubbed it the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Murders. Law enforcement struggled. No arrests were ever made. Suspects came and went, including whispers about Ted Bundy and the Zodiac Killer, but none were ever tied to the murders with evidence. The killer, or killers, disappeared as suddenly as the victims had. What remained was a list of names, a map of dump sites, and a file cabinet full of unanswered questions. As investigators began compiling data from each case, a disturbing pattern started to emerge, one that spoke to both the identity of the victims and the mind of the killer. All the victims were young, ranging from middle school girls to women in their early 20s. They were last seen in moments of transit, on their way somewhere. Most were walking, hitchhiking, or trying to return home. The perpetrator was hunting in plain sight, capitalizing on casual vulnerability. That accessibility made the killer both effective and unpredictable. The method of disposal was consistent. Each victim was found nude. Their bodies had been discarded without care, as if they were trash. Most were dumped in remote rural areas, creek beds, ravines, steep hillsides. Law enforcement concluded the killer possessed physical strength or assistance from another person, as the locations were often difficult to access. Yet within that consistency, the murders varied in disturbing ways. Some victims had their necks broken, others were strangled. One, Carolyn Davis, was poisoned with strychnine. In one of the most chilling cases, 19-year-old Kim Wendy Allen was strangled slowly over a 30-minute period, an act of prolonged torture and psychological control. The combination of violent intimacy followed by impersonal disposal painted a portrait of a killer with two faces. On one hand, the precision and cruelty suggested sadism, someone who wanted to control and dehumanize. On the other, the act of tossing the bodies away reflected complete detachment. It wasn't enough to kill. The bodies had to be erased from view, hidden in nature, severed from any memory or meaning. Investigators theorized that the killer might have interviewed the victims before attacking. There was some indication of casual conversation or trust building before the violence began. That added another layer of terror. The idea that these victims might have shared a car ride, a joke, or even a false sense of safety before they were murdered. Understanding the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Murders begins with honoring the lives that were lost. These were not just names in a cold case file. They were daughters, students, and friends, each with a story that ended far too soon. Maureen Sterling, 12, and Yvonne Weber, 13, were the youngest known victims. On February 4, 1972, they left their Santa Rosa homes to visit an ice rink. They never returned. It wasn't until 10 months later, on December 28th, that their remains were found down an embankment off Franz Valley Road. The girls were skeletal by the time they were discovered, and the exact cause of death could not be determined. Kim Wendy Allen, 19, was a student at Santa Rosa Junior College. On March 4, 1972, she was last seen hitchhiking near Highway 101. The next day, her nude body was found in a creek bed. Her wrists were bound with clothesline. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The brutality of her murder suggested she may have been held for some time before being killed. Lori Lee Cursa, 13, had a history of running away from home. She was reported missing in November 1972. On December 14th, her body was found at the bottom of a ravine off Calistoga Road. Her neck was broken, possibly from being pushed or falling out of a moving car. Carolyn Davis, 15, was from Anderson, California. After leaving home in July 1973, she was last seen hitchhiking near Santa Rosa. Her decomposed remains were discovered on July 31st, just feet from where Sterling and Weber were found. She had been poisoned with strychnine. Teresa Walsh, 23, had been visiting family. On December 22, 1973, she was last seen trying to hitchhike home. Her body was discovered 6 days later by kayakers in Mark-West Creek. She had been hog-tied, raped, and strangled. Each death intensified the fear in the region. Though the cases shared similarities, the differences in cause of death left law enforcement struggling to identify whether they were dealing with one evolving killer or several working in disturbing parallel. Unsolved puzzle of the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Murders, one victim's story has remained largely in the shadows until now. Her name was Yvonne Quilantang, and though she wasn't found in Sonoma County or on a rural roadside, the FBI believed her case was connected, and her story may hold more answers than anyone realized. Yvonne was just 15 years old in June 1973. She lived with a foster family in San Francisco, Visitacion Valley, a tough but tight-knit neighborhood. Her life was already complicated. She was 6 to 7 months pregnant, reportedly with a boyfriend stationed in the Army and a local man suspected to be the baby's father. She was young, vulnerable, and trying to find her place in a world that hadn't made it easy for her. On Saturday, June 9th, she told her foster sister she was heading to the neighborhood Cala store to grab a pack of cigarettes. But just as she was about to leave, the phone rang. She answered. Witnesses later recalled her arguing with a man on the other end. After hanging up, she walked out the door and never came back. The next day, June 10th, 2 children playing in a trash-strewn vacant lot on Galvez Avenue in San Francisco's Bayview district made a horrifying discovery, a nude, battered body. It was Yvonne. She had been strangled to death. Her clothes were never recovered. Her unborn child did not survive. At first glance, her murder looked unrelated. It happened in an urban lot, not a wooded roadside or rural embankment. But in 1975, her name appeared on a secret FBI report linking 14 unsolved murders across Northern California. The Bureau believed she was part of the same pattern. Despite the location, Yvonne fit the profile. Young, female, vulnerable, murdered by asphyxiation, and left naked. Her story didn't fall outside the pattern. It expanded it. 2 years after Yvonne's murder, a confidential FBI report quietly reshaped the scope of the case. It didn't make headlines, it wasn't part of a press conference, but to those who saw it, it was a turning point. The document identified 14 unsolved homicides of young women between 1972 and 1974, murders that stretched from Santa Rosa to San Francisco and beyond. Yvonne Quilantang's name was on that list. So were other victims not previously connected to the Santa Rosa murders. Rosa Vasquez, 20, found strangled in Golden Gate Park, May 1973. Angela Thomas, 16, smothered and found on a school playground in Daly City, July 1973. All of them shared key elements. Young and female killed by strangulation or smothering, found nude. Discarded in areas where they might go unnoticed. This report challenged the existing assumption that the killer only operated in rural Sonoma County. Instead, it suggested the killer, or killers, were mobile, adaptable, and operating across city and county lines. For years, the difference in geography between Yvonne's case and the others had raised doubts. But the FBI saw a deeper thread tying them together. For investigators, this created an uneasy realization. The killer wasn't confined to one hunting ground. He may have commuted. He may have lived in San Francisco and worked in Santa Rosa, or the other way around. The pattern wasn't just about location. It was about behavior, choice of victim, method, and mindset. More importantly, the FBI's inclusion of Yvonne wasn't speculative. It was strategic. Her murder fit a broader, more disturbing pattern, one that suggested a level of planning and confidence. Her pregnancy, her vulnerability, and her neighborhood didn't make her less likely to be part of the spree. They made her the exact type of target a predator might seek out. While the other victims were taken from highways and dumped in remote forests, Yvonne Quilantang's murder unfolded in the heart of a city. And that matters. It wasn't just the location of her death that made her case different. It was everything surrounding it: the neighborhood, the timing, and the social climate of San Francisco in the early 1970s. Yvonne lived in Visitacion Valley, a working-class district bordering McLaren Park, far from the postcard version of San Francisco. Just a few blocks away, Bayview Hunters Point was grappling with economic upheaval. The nearby Hunters Point Naval Shipyard, once a major employer, was nearing permanent closure. Crime was rising. Public services were thin. For many residents, it felt like they were being forgotten by the city around them. This backdrop gave predators more than shadows to hide in. It gave them silence. In neighborhoods already fighting for visibility, a missing pregnant teenager might not generate the same urgency as a missing girl from a wealthier zip code. In a city divided by class and race, the value placed on a victim's life often varied with the block she lived on. Yvonne's foster situation made her even more vulnerable. Without a strong family structure or legal guardianship, there were fewer people in positions to demand action or follow up when the case stalled. And while her killer may have left her in a public lot, that lot was surrounded by neglect, garbage strewn, overgrown, forgotten. In that environment, it's not hard to imagine why the killer might have felt confident. It wasn't just about convenience. It was about targeting a space where the crime might go unnoticed or worse, ignored. The difference in location doesn't weaken the connection to the Santa Rosa murders. It exposes another layer: that the killer may have known where to act based on who society was least likely to protect. For decades, the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Murders remained a terrifying mystery. Dozens of suspects came and went, some infamous, some obscure. Theories tied the crimes to the Zodiac Killer, to Ted Bundy, and even to local sex offenders. But no one was ever arrested. Then in 2024, a documentary titled The Truth About Jim aired on HBO, and the case was pulled back into the spotlight. The film introduced a new name into public consciousness: Jim Mordecai. Mordecai had never been charged with any of the murders. In fact, before the documentary aired, his name wasn't even widely known. But through newly uncovered documents, interviews, and law enforcement reports, the filmmakers made a case for reconsideration. They alleged that Mordecai, who lived in Northern California during the exact years of the killings, had a disturbing history of violence toward women, proximity to multiple dump sites, and had been quietly questioned by police in the 1970s, only to slip through the cracks due to lack of evidence. What made Mordecai so compelling wasn't just his record. It was his geographic overlap with both the Santa Rosa and San Francisco murder scenes. He lived in the North Bay. He worked odd jobs in construction and delivery, jobs that would be given him access to remote rural roads as well as urban neighborhoods like Bayview. Most chilling of all, the documentary included interviews with former acquaintances, some of whom recounted unsettling behavior, sudden disappearances, and even dark confessions made while drunk. One woman described him as having a strange obsession with the news stories about the missing girls. Another recalled him growing defensive when the subject of the Bayview murder came up, specifically Yvonne's. Law enforcement has not reopened the case officially, But the documentary led to a flood of new tips. Cold case investigators began quietly reviewing old files again, and for the first time in decades, the name Yvonne Quilantang trended on search engines. The theory is still just that, a theory. But the presence of Jim Mordecai in this narrative gives the case a contemporary relevance and a new line of questioning. 50 years have passed, yet the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker murders remain unsolved. No charges, no confirmed suspect, no justice for the victims or their families. The files still sit in archives. The roadside crosses fade in the sun, and for many, the fear never fully left. With the reemergence of Yvonne Quilantang's case through the 1975 FBI report and the 2024 documentary's focus on Jim Mordecai, a few key questions now frame the mystery. Was there really one killer? The cause of death varied. Strangulation, poisoning, broken necks. Some victims were assaulted, others weren't. Yet the FBI believed the cases were connected. If they were right, it points to an unusually adaptable killer, someone capable of changing methods while maintaining a consistent pattern of victim type and disposal. Why was Yvonne left in an urban lot? It's the most visible of all the crime scenes. No remote hills, no forested valleys. Was it a statement? Or had something gone wrong? Was the killer growing bolder or more reckless? Was race or class a factor in how the victims were investigated? Yvonne was biracial, pregnant, and in foster care. She lived in one of the most economically isolated neighborhoods in San Francisco. Did those factors contribute to her being overlooked in earlier investigations? Would her story have been treated differently had she lived elsewhere? Could the killer still be alive? If Jim Mordecai or someone like him is responsible, they would likely be in their 70s or 80s today. Time may have run out for a prosecution, but closure, even without a conviction, remains possible. And finally, why now? Why did this story resurface in 2024? The answer may lie in changing public values. There's a growing appetite for restorative justice, for centering the victim's voice. In that shift, stories like Yvonne's are no longer sidelined. They read the lens through which everything else is seen. In most summaries of the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker murders, Yvonne Quilantang's name is either a footnote or left out entirely. Her case didn't fit the standard pattern. Her death didn't come with a rural setting or a known hitchhiking route. But if you look past the surface details, her story may be the most telling of all. Yvonne was not just a statistic. She was 15 years old, preparing for motherhood, caught between childhood and adulthood. She had friends. She had a foster sister she joked with. She had dreams, complications, and a future, even if it was uncertain. Her life was messy, but it was hers. And it was stolen. She didn't disappear on a long journey. She stepped outside for a quick errand and never came back. She likely knew her killer. That phone call before she left, short, angry, and final, might have been her last chance to say no. But she still walked out the door. Her death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a signal. A sign that the killer's reach extended beyond the highways and back roads of Sonoma County, into the neighborhoods of San Francisco, into the lives of girls who didn't hitchhike, who didn't match the expected narrative, but were still targeted just the same. To say her name today is to acknowledge that her story mattered. That she didn't get the headlines or the documentaries until recently isn't her fault, it is ours. But now, with renewed attention, her case can be part of a fuller truth. Not just about a series of murders, but about how we decide whose stories are told and whose are left behind. Yvonne Quilantang should never have been a footnote. She should have been the headline from the beginning. The Santa Rosa Hitchhiker murders are not just a story of unsolved crimes. They are a mirror reflecting the fractures in how justice is pursued, remembered, and prioritized. These cases spanned rural roads and urban lots, wealthy suburbs and working-class neighborhoods. But the outcomes were tragically consistent. No arrests, no answers, and too many voices lost. For years, the narrative was narrowly focused. 7 known victims, all tied to rural dump sites, mostly hitchhikers. But that story was incomplete. Victims like Yvonne Quilantang weren't simply outliers. They were part of a bigger truth, a truth that took a confidential 1975 FBI report and a 2024 documentary revival to bring into the light. The modern audience is no longer satisfied with surface-level recaps or nameless statistics. There is a growing demand for depth, for clarity, and above all, for restorative storytelling. In that landscape, Yvonne's story matters more than ever. Justice may never come in the form of a courtroom conviction. The killer, whoever he was, may already be gone. But that does not mean the story ends in silence. Justice, in cases like these, sometimes looks like remembrance. Sometimes it looks like a community saying, "We see you. We didn't forget." This is how we reclaim forgotten lives, not just by solving crimes, but by refusing to let them disappear. So now, as new eyes return to old files, one thing must remain clear. Yvonne Quilantang was never just a side note. She is part of the story. And the story isn't finished yet.